So that was great to have both Google, Facebook, and Alibaba on the same stage. We'll continue the pace. I hope a lot of the acoustic issues have been solved, and you're still having a problem. Please, I will ask you to move to the sides because the problem is happens to be in the middle because of the echo. So before we move on to the next panel, I wanted to do a quick quiz. My organizer just told me that we sold out, so I'm extremely happy for that. But I wanted to ask, let's do a quick quiz in terms of, we have people from a lot of countries represented here. As a show of hands, I wanted to do, how many countries do you think are represented here today at this conference? So raise your hand, I will ask you a question, and whoever is closest to this gets a Google Home. So here, go ahead. 100? You have to come down a little bit. Go ahead. 256. I'm not sure that many countries even exist. 70. You come, guys, come. You don't set the expectation, so I come down. I see somebody from there, here. 48. 25, come down. We are still a good conference, but not that great a conference. 10, you have to go up. 28, I hear 28. Let's do 2 or 3 more here. 99 is too high. Guys here. 16. I hear 17 here. Okay, we have 17 different countries represented, all the way from, of course, we surprisingly have nobody from South America, but we have North America, Europe, Asia, Australia represented here. So thanks for that, and please connect with me to collect your Google Home. So anyway, so I'm super excited to introduce you to the next panel. It's a pleasure to introduce Mr. James Manyika. He is the chairman and director of McKinsey Global Institute. I had the pleasure of working with him, and I have to say he's one of the most brilliant person I've ever worked with. No wonder he is also the vice chair of Obama International Development Council, also a deep PhD in AI 20 years back. AI was not that hard, so you can imagine he was probably saw this coming. And he is also a fellow at DeepMind. So please welcome James Manyika to the stage.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you again this year. It was fun to be here last year when we had this first conference. You've now heard a lot of discussion so far about the technical progress and all the amazing things that are happening in AI and machine learning, and it's fabulous, it's fantastic. It's certainly way more progress than when I worked in AI 20 years ago and I got my PhD then. We've made far, far, far greater progress. What I was going to focus this discussion on is to give you at least a view, perhaps from the point of view of businesses, and how they are thinking about AI and how they think about adopting the tools and techniques and the technologies that you're all developing. This draws from the research that we do, as well as the work that McKinsey does around the world with mostly large and medium-sized companies. So here we go. You've all made this point that we've made tremendous progress that now exceeds and matches and exceeds human capacity in some areas. This simply points to image recognition. But here's what I want to spend some time on. We're going to talk a little bit about, so who's investing and where are they investing? Who's adopting AI and how? And also, how can business improve its own performance and innovation using these techniques? And what needs to happen to accelerate the progress of all of that? When you look at the scale of investments, so this looks at where the money, largely in venture capital, is going around the world, primarily in the US, in Europe, and in China. Where's the money actually going, in what categories? Now, clearly there's a fair amount of overlap in some of these categories here in terms of how companies think about them, but this is where the venture capital investments in AI are going. As you can see, things that are largely categorized as machine learning are getting a little bit more than half the investments in the venture capital world. But you've also got very specific things in computer vision, in natural language processing, in virtual assistants, and also in robotics and autonomous vehicles. This is just a view from the venture capital point of view. If you then look at, so how does this actually, so how much are we talking about? This is upwards now of $9 billion. In fact, we were just recently updating these data sets. And again, this is largely from the point of view of venture capital. And as you can see, if venture capital is spending about $9 billion investing in new technology, AI is probably the second largest category of where this money and investments are going. And you see that that's where we're seeing the most growth. It is the second most growth in terms of growth of investments. If you then contrast this with how much are companies investing, and so this is looking at largely the large tech giants and how much they're investing. So clearly they're investing a heck of a lot more, close to $30 billion in investments by companies themselves through the acquisitions that they're making, but also internal investments into AI and machine learning kinds of capabilities and tools. And that obviously is much bigger than what you see the venture capital community investing. And this has grown pretty rapidly, as you can see in this trend line over to the right, starting in 2010, looking at where roughly we are in 2016, 2017. And it's interesting when you then compare this picture across North America, Europe, and Asia. This largely tells you that by and large right now, it's a North America, Asia, specifically China game, to be perfectly frank. That's where almost all the investments are, and that's where the growth in investments, both on the corporate side, the business side, as well as on the venture capital side. And Europe so far is lagging, by and large, and that's looking at roughly the 28 countries that make up the European Union and how much they're collectively investing in these techniques. And of course, there's lots of use cases and applications. This is just a sample of, we and others have been trawling through the numerous number of use cases that are emerging. And you can see they span all industries. And what's interesting about the impact potential is that on the vertical axis, the impact potential goes up dramatically as you think about data and availability in use cases. As you know, you need training data to train the algorithms, so you clearly have much higher impact whenever you've got higher levels of availability of data, and the impact goes up. But the kinds of examples are the kinds of things you all are doing and talking about, everything from fraud detection to claims processing, to identification and optimizing merchandising strategies in retail sectors and so forth. So there's a lot of use cases, and so clearly the benefits are there. Having said that, despite the overwhelming evidence of the value and impact from the use cases, we find that actually when you look at large companies, the adoption is actually relatively slow, even though most companies now are fully aware of AI and machine learning techniques. But we find that the actual adoption is actually relatively slow. And this is looking at a large sample of large companies across Europe, the US, and China specifically, to look at the rates of adoption. And what you find that the early adopters are typically adopting a few specific things, as opposed to, and a whole bunch of others are mostly experimenting. So there's a lot of kind of experimentation that's going on. And there's even a larger number of the 40% of this group that are still just thinking about it. They're talking about it, but they're not doing very much. So far, adoption rates are relatively slow. And when you look at, so what's the reason the non-adopters are not adopting? And you hear different kinds of perspectives in those discussions. You'll hear that, well, maybe the business case isn't quite there yet. They don't quite see the business case. Some will actually say, well, we're not quite sure that the business case is there. We're not yet fully convinced of the return on investment. What you also hear will be, well, we don't have the technical capabilities. And typically when people describe, and large companies describe the technical capabilities, they're talking both about access to the tools in their minds, rightly or wrongly, as well as access to talent. And talent is usually the big question that they talk about when they talk about the lack of capabilities. So I think there's still something about how do we expand the capacity and access to talent, and also access to the availability of tools and applications to do the kinds of things that the non-adopters see as challenges. But having said that, there are some sectors that are far ahead of others in terms of the adoption rates. So what we call the frontier sectors. So clearly the tech industry itself is a big adopter of this, telcos and tech industry. The automotive industry actually has been a big adopter lately, as well as finance. And there are others that are much, much, much slower in adopting these technologies and tools. And what's interesting is that if you look at the potential, and this is looking at what we call the Digitization Transformation Index, which tries to get at the question of which sectors have the biggest potential to be transformed by digitization. And the vertical axis speaks to, and what is the AI index, which takes into account the availability of labeled and other data, as well as the prevalence and applicability of the tools that are being developed. And you suddenly see that there are some sectors that are much higher up on this potential frame than others. So what seem to be the characteristics of the sectors and others who are kind of early adopters? They tend to be companies that that are quite digitally mature. So they've done a lot of the kind of basic digitization of their capabilities and infrastructure. They're relatively digitally mature. They're already using the cloud in some form. They're already using core basic analytics in some form. So they're relatively mature. They also have tended to be larger businesses, actually, much more so than much, much, much smaller businesses. Although, of course, it's different if we're talking about startups. So when I say small business, I'm talking about small businesses in other kinds of sectors. They tend not to be as big adopters. And then they also tend to actually apply artificial intelligence techniques to their core business in a very deep and meaningful way. And they also tend to be companies that are much more focused on growth and innovation as opposed to cost reduction and cost savings. So despite all the talk about the motivation being about substituting labor cost, that tends not to be the motivation for the early adopters. They typically are looking to innovate, they typically are looking to grow, and they typically are looking to transform their businesses. And almost always, you find that there's somebody in the C-suite who's a big champion, either the CEO themselves or somebody in the C-suite is a big champion of using these techniques. What's also interesting, so what we're showing here is the dark blue shows, if you like, core analytics. So this is before, if you think about just traditional analytics, they have an enormous potential to impact these sectors and these businesses. The light blue speaks to the additional potential impact when you start to use machine learning techniques, because we've had other traditional analytics before. So what's the extra impact you might get? And you suddenly see that sectors like financial institutions, which is FIG here, healthcare systems, and also even the public and social sector tend to benefit and have a big part of their value coming from also applying these machine learning techniques. And if you look at the numerous use cases that we're seeing and others are seeing, and you say, where could they have the biggest impact on revenue and growth for companies? You suddenly see that there are some sectors like telecom and media where they're already having lots of impact already. And you find that one of the characteristics of that is because these tend to be sectors where you've got a high data availability, and it's particularly labeled and structured data that's available in these sectors. Whereas subsectors, even though the impact may be high, the data availability is not as wide as you might expect. And then you've also got other sectors where these are very operations-oriented sectors, and the impact is also a little bit different in those sectors. Where the possibilities to improve how supply chains work and operate. Let me also point to other sectors like PMP, which typically speaks to the sectors like pharmaceuticals, where there's a lot of drug discovery and R&D activity, where these techniques actually contribute a lot to the innovation, drug discovery of new solutions, and that tends to drive why the potential value is actually quite high. As you can see, so there's different patterns of value capture and value creation based on the kind of sector that it is, the availability of data in that sector, and the impact. So all of this to say, the impact actually varies by sector quite a bit. And you get a different mix and patterns of where the impact and where the potential might actually be. So what should businesses be doing? I think one of the things we often tell a lot of large businesses and encourage all of you to do is that I think it's very important that they fully understand where the source of value is and also understand the data ecosystem, because we know that one of the limiting factors is data availability inside the company, but also in the ecosystem that they operate in. And then the use of techniques and tools, whether it's use of the ones that are publicly available like TensorFlow and others, but there's a prevalent, a large number of tool sets that are available and possible that they should take advantage of. And then, of course, there's the challenge of how do you integrate this into the workflow, and how do you think about organizations that operate in a very open way. So these are some of the things we encourage companies to think about. And I think there's a lot, all of you as developers of these technologies, that you can do to capitalize on this kind of information to have impact, at least building applications and tool sets that can deliver real impact for the sectors that you operate in. So thank you very much. This research, by the way, is widely and freely available. Happy to let you all download it.